Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. There's still a few participants who are connecting, so we're going to wait a minute and then we'll get started. So my name is Arthur Gallinat. I'm the director of the ISSS at the University of Connecticut, and I'm your SIW coordinator this year. Thank you so much for joining us today. I just have a little housekeeping, and then I am happy to turn it over to our first keynote speaker. First, some Zoom tips. Feel free to change your name in Zoom. You can list your institution and your pronouns. Feel free to turn on your video so that we can see you and interact with you. Be sure to mute yourself so that there's no disruptions for our presenters. Please feel free to submit any questions in the chat or to connect with your colleagues through the chat function. And again, ask questions. And then, some general information. The Spring Immigration Workshop is hosted by NAFSA Region 11's Government Regulations Advisory Committee, affectionately known as GRAC. I'm a member. Susanna, who's our Zoom coordinator and here with us today, is a member. We're a Region 11 subcommittee focused on U.S. laws, rules, and regulations that pertain to international students and scholars, people who are employed or visiting educational institutions. Every year, GRAC coordinates the SIW, and we help support the regional conference as we can. We put out a call for new members every June. Please keep an eye on your email if you want to get involved in the future. Joining GRAC is a great way. We will be sending out an assessment and a survey at the end of the week about Spring Immigration Workshop, and there'll be an opportunity for you to share with GRAC if you want to present or participate or volunteer in the future. And so please keep your eyes open for your email. And with that, I'm gonna introduce our presenter today. So we are very excited to welcome Jill Welch from the President's Alliance on Higher Education and Immigration as our first of two keynote addresses this week. Tomorrow at 1 o'clock, we'll have our second keynote address. Jill Welch was formerly the Deputy Executive Director of Public Policy at NAFSA and now serves as a Senior Policy Advisor to the President's Alliance on International Student and Refugee Learner Issues. With more than 2 decades of experience serving both inside and outside of government, Jill has been advancing public policies that internationalize U.S. higher education, modernize the U.S. immigration system, and renew our democratic republic to advance for the common good for all. Jill specializes in public policy advocacy, strategic communications, public engagement, and public-private partnerships. And so I know it's difficult via Zoom, but if everyone can try and give as warm a welcome as you can via Zoom, we're very happy to welcome Jill Welch to the NAFSA Region 11 Spring Immigration Workshop. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jill.
Thank you, Arthur. And it's good to see some familiar faces. I just scrolled quickly down the list of the participants here to see who I can know. And it's great to see so many of you again. As you may know, there's what I call Jill 2.0 now in charge of the public policy efforts at NAFSA. And I had the pleasure of working with her when I was still at NAFSA. And so there's a great team over there still, and it's great to be with you all. So let's see, I'm going to try and share my screen here and see if I succeed. I think I will. Let's see how we do here. Voila. Okay, great. Let's go back into presentation. There we go. Perfect. Okay. So as Arthur said, I'm with the President's Alliance. In case you're not familiar with us, it's a coalition of university and college presidents who formed together in 2017 in reaction, frankly, to that election at the time and the fear for the undocumented students in particular, but also international and refugee students who might have had more challenges as they tried to be present on US campuses. And so I think at the time there were probably just a dozen presidents, and now there are over 550 university colleges and presidents. And the Alliance focuses on bringing together these communities, these college and university leaders, to focus on three key populations: the international students, the refugees, and the undocumented students. Knowing that, as you know from your work, those are immigration classifications, but there's a lot of overlap in terms of people's experiences. Someone may start as an undocumented student and end up a citizen, very unlikely, but sometimes it happens. And then there are some refugees who end up being international students, or vice versa. But of course, the immigration classifications are very specific. I also run a consulting firm that focuses on uniting a diversity of perspectives toward a common good. Arthur spoke about my passion for democracy. So I moved to Washington, D.C. in the 90s and have been here ever since, trying to make this government work for the people, by the people, of the people. And I'm really pleased to be able to talk with you today, because I think we have some opportunities to do that type of thing as we go forward for immigration. So what I was hoping to do with you today is give you an outlook from DC, what I would call Jill on the Hill, a little bit of a view of what's happening here in Washington, talk some about the progress to date that the advocacy community in international ed and immigration has made, some of the top priorities moving forward, and then what next. And we'll just kind of go through that. And then there'll be time at the end where I know it's not completely interactive, at least I believe it's not completely interactive in a voice way. So I think we're going to take questions in the chat, but if y'all want to do it differently, I'm good with that too, because definitely want to hear your voices. So when we look to the outlook of what's going on, it's no surprise to anyone that the division in Congress continues. And now we have a divided government in the sense that, of course, the House is controlled by the Democrats, was controlled by the Democrats, controlled by the Republicans, and the Senate is controlled very narrowly by the Democrats, and the White House controlled by the Democrats as well, in President Biden and Harris's administration. So what we're seeing is, you see this, I know you see this wherever you are, you can tell that there's kind of a bitter partisan divide everywhere. However, the Democrats in the Senate are really looking for ways to do bipartisan action together. And you're all aware that at the end of the last Congress, there was quite a bit of legislation that passed in a bipartisan way, not meaning fully bipartisan, meaning it wasn't all in on both parties, but there were some Republicans who voted for the Democratic legislation that Biden signed into law on things like infrastructure and pandemic related things. So what we'll see on immigration is that the Democrats in the Senate particularly will not want to move forward in isolation. They will try their best to get Democrats to come along. I mean, excuse me, I'm all talking about Democrats today. Try to get Republicans to come along with them. And that means that a bill, for example, that we've been trying to get introduced in the Senate for some time, we're really working very hard to get a Republican who will partner on that bill before it gets introduced. I think you'll also see a difference in the agendas of the two parties as we look into this Congress. The Republicans, particularly in the House, are very focused on oversight and investigations. They've already been holding a number of hearings to try to showcase their disagreements with the White House. And so they're going to focus largely on those kinds of things. And the Democrats, as I mentioned, are trying to focus on getting some bipartisan legislation. The key players are familiar to you all, but just wanted to point out the consequences for us as a field in what happened with the McCarthy election for Speaker of the House. When the, let me go back up. When the Republicans won the House, but more narrowly than expected. You'll all recall that it took 15 votes for McCarthy to win the speakership. And in the process of that, he made a lot of compromises with those Republicans who were holding out and refusing to vote for him. And what that means is that there are some really contentious fights ahead on some of the key must-pass bills for Congress. So with the appropriations bills, that includes funding for a lot of federal programs and that your institutions will be very keen on paying attention to, the process will be very different this time around, because any member from the House can offer amendments on the floor when they start considering those bills. So they're going to be much harder to pass. And I think it's going to be a much more contentious process. It's also the case that he conceded that any Republican could call for his removal at any point during the Congress. And so that's also going to keep him trying to keep those people happy who he really needed the votes of in order to be elected. So while I think there might be some Republicans in the House who have a more moderate view on immigration, there are those who don't, who are going to be trying to push that agenda pretty vehemently during the whole Congress. When I'm sharing all of that with you, the main thing I want to be sure we take away is that I think in Washington, there are a lot of organizations who are trying to say, you know what, let's just forget about Congress. It's too complicated. Can we just focus on the states where the action seems to be moving? But I've been in this city long enough to notice that when you're not at the table, you're usually on the menu. And so I would just encourage you all to stay engaged at the federal level on the immigration matters that matter and most to you and to your students and scholars, because it's inevitable that some of those who will try to move legislation or even through oversight try to shape how the administration does its policies. We have to be present at all times in order to make sure that we protect the populations we're trying to serve. In terms of the members of Congress who are going to still be present, the familiar faces, a lot of the people who've been in leadership for a long time are still there, but committees have changed and leadership of committees have changed. So I think you know that, for example, Bernie Sanders from Vermont has taken over as head of education. And people feel alternatively good or bad about that, depending on which part of education they're in. But for Vermonters, that offers an opportunity to keep him educated about this piece of it, because as we well know, the way the Hill organizes its work, they have different staffers usually who handle the education portfolio than who handle the immigration portfolio. So that means that for us, we usually have to work on two relationships. We have to try to keep the relationship going with the education staffer as well as the immigration staffer, sometimes foreign policy staffers as well. So let's talk a little bit about the progress. Oops, excuse me. I'm very bad at that, aren't I? Just one sec. There we go. Talk about the progress that's happened to date, because I think it's important to take a moment to reflect on how we're doing before we start thinking about what's next. And there are some really good things that have happened in the past couple of years for international education and for our international students and scholars and our dreamers to some extent, and also even a little bit for refugee students. And the first one that I want to highlight is this welcoming narrative that the administration has started to adopt. This dates back, for those of you who've been in the field for a long time, you remember that Bill Clinton had a joint memorandum on international education that he signed before he left, and that resulted in the International Education Week that we all celebrate in November. But in addition to that, it also, it was meant to be a policy that would actually try to coordinate the agencies, so that Consular was talking to ECA within the same bureau or the same agency state, but also that state and commerce were talking, or that if DHS was doing something that wasn't welcoming there was a chance to air that and try to make sure that things work smoothly. So, and of course, when Bill Clinton was president, there wasn't a DHS. That was Immigration and Naturalization Service that later became DHS. But the idea was that these agencies would coordinate. So with this new administration, there's a renewed effort to get back to that type of policy. And they started with what's called the Joint Statement of Principles on International Education, and they reaffirm the interest of the U.S. government in welcoming international students and scholars. There are a lot of other things in that statement, if you haven't seen it, that deal with other aspects of international education, study abroad, foreign language learning, et cetera. But for the purpose of this workshop, the spring convening that you're doing now, I think the international student part is the most important. And they're meeting regularly to try to implement those things. And I think what we will see over the remainder of this term of this administration and moving forward, hopefully whoever's in power as we move forward, the bureaucrats within the agencies really want to continue this progress that they're making and start to make these principles turn more into policy over time, though they'll never say they're going for policy because they can't get ahead of the elected officials. But I think they really are trying to make sure these things become real. The second thing that is really, really important for our field is the consular improvements that have been made. There have been a number of improvements. The most significant one is the updating of the Foreign Affairs Manual. And this is something that NAFSA, the President's Alliance, and some others advocated for. As you recall, during the Trump administration, there was language removed from the Foreign Affairs Manual that basically guided consular officers how to view intent to immigrate. And it also had, there was language in there that talked about how to think of lesser known colleges or community colleges or English language programs, and trying to encourage the consular officers not to second guess the academic decisions of the individual applying for the student visa in the first place. And that language had been removed in the Trump administration, but Biden's administration has restored that language and made some further improvements. And so the Immigration and Nationality Act is still in effect, and we still have single intent for F visas, meaning they can only intend to be a non-immigrant at the point of their consular interview. However, the State Department has done an enormous amount of work and done good work to give consular officers as much flexibility as possible in interpreting that at the point of the interviews. So now students applying have to prove their intent to depart at the end of their program, which is different than intent to return home. And they have to prove, and this is similar to what was there during the Obama administration, they have to prove what their intent is at the time of the consular interview. The consular officer is not supposed to look 4 years into the future and make predictions of what they think will happen. So that's really helpful. I think I'd like to hear from you, and maybe you want to chime in the chat if you want, but I don't know that it's working as well for displaced students and students in crisis. About their intent to depart. I don't know if they're being viewed as favorably about their intentions to depart at the end of their program. I know that there's a lot of work being done by higher ed institutions and those who counsel these students to make sure that when they apply, and I'm talking here of Afghans and Ukrainians and students from other parts of the world, to make sure when they apply that they do understand the INA and that they have to prove they don't intend to immigrate. And to have them have a reasonable plan of what they would do at the end of their program, whether it's going to another country or whatever. So I'd be interested in your feedback about that, and I'll take a look at the chat later when I'm done talking, but I would be interested in your feedback, whether you're seeing any changes since that FAM guidance has been updated and if that's been helpful to you and your students. Another positive change is that some harmful rules were withdrawn. And so we no longer have to worry about OPT being under immediate threat. It still had some court battles, but that's going pretty well for the program right now. the courts are still considering it, but the last court action was in our favor of continuing OPT. And there's not the harmful rule that would have governed H-1Bs is not there anymore either, although there will be a new H-1B modernization rule coming out under this administration that I'm sure will merit comment. There have been some security advisory opinion improvements. I would also be interested in the chat in your feedback about whether you're noticing any changes here. This is the kind of thing it's very hard to tell if you are seeing the benefit. You always feel the pain when it's not working. But the State Department has very recently, I want to say within the last month, so not very long ago, maybe 2 months, but not months ago, they've made some changes so that the process is more streamlined and not as many students and scholars would have to go through the security advisory opinion process in order to get their visas. It's still very much focused on security, so it's my understanding that these changes would not affect national security interest, but just keep the system from getting clogged with people who don't need to be in that process. So we should see changes. We at the President's Alliance had requested a liaison for higher education with the State Department so that when somebody gets stuck in that process, there would be a way to contact them and see how it's going, what the timeline might be. You know, they can't usually tell you which agency is holding up the process or anything, but try to have some way to make sure the person's still in line and that things are moving forward. I know a lot of you use your federal relations officers and congressional representation to try to do that right now. And the State Department had indicated they were open to that. The consular office had indicated they were open to that, but they really don't believe it's going to be necessary with these new improvements. So if we are still having a problem with SAOs, it'd be really good to raise those with NAFSA, either through your regions toward the national office or whatever ways you most like to do it. I know that the reg practice team at NAFSA, David and Steve are fantastic and others there. And then you can also raise it with Rachel Banks, Heather Stewart, Jill Ellen Murray at the NAFSA office. And then I'm always available to hear about those problems as well. And in case I forget to give it to you, my email is jill@presidentsalliance.org, presidents with an S, alliance.org, no punctuation in there other than the dot. And then finally, there's a new program for refugees underway, which is really exciting. And this is something that the administration has been doing to try to rebuild the refugee resettlement program that was dismantled. And one of the things they've done is to implement private sponsorship. And in private sponsorship, this is something that will eventually, not yet, but will eventually result in the ability of a group of citizens or institutions or people at an institution, like a higher ed institution, being able to what's called identify or name refugees that they would like to have admitted to the U.S. So as you're aware, currently those processes are pretty much not run by non-government actors in terms of how we identify who's coming here. The program will eventually allow more private sponsorship. And so welcome.us and Welcome Core have been launched, and those are allowing some of that to happen. And the next phase will include higher ed sponsorship. And the President's Alliance is incredibly engaged on that. You'll see in my logo behind my head something called the Response Campaign. If you Google that, you'll find many more resources about what this program is and how it will work. And we can keep you in the loop about how that can result. It's my understanding that when the program is launched, it'll probably focus on somewhere in East Africa first in its pilot phase, which I think is exciting because I think that's a part of the world where refugees do not get enough attention. So we're happy and excited to see that develop. Now, what's next? Where are the opportunities for influence? And I kind of want to talk about this in two ways. I want to talk about what the administration could and should do, and then I also want to talk about what Congress could and should do. And when I talk about opportunities for influence, I think you all have your favorite ways that you like to go about making change happen. And I'm pretty sure a lot of people find benefit in going through your organizations and associations to help guide your work. Erica Stewart over at NAFSA does a fantastic job of keeping you all on the loop. So those are really great ways to do it. But I just hope to give you kind of a broad overview of some of what we see as priorities. And then again, in the chat, would love to hear your feedback about other priorities you think are really where the community should coalesce in their advocacy, given the division and noise and difficulties and challenges I spoke of earlier. I think it's really important for us to prioritize on those things where we get the most value if we had it to happen, and also where there might be opportunities for that. So the first is a continued prioritization of welcoming international students and scholars, and we'd really like to see the administration go even further on this. They're doing, as I said, a good job of starting to shape the narrative a bit and doing some of these welcoming policies. But we still, as a country, as you well know, lack an actual set of goals for what we're trying to do when it comes to welcoming international students and scholars. So while other countries have actual numeric goals or global goals, we don't have those as a country. And so it would be really beneficial if we did, because then the policies can line up to make sure those are being met. Related to that, we believe there needs to be a greater focus on diversity and inclusion. So currently, when you look at, the pandemic was very informative in this way. When you look at the global trends of where the students have been coming from in recent years, the majority of students come from, say 4 countries. And then the pandemic hit and everything changed. And, we didn't really have a new infrastructure in place to help us build in other parts of the world. Consular is interested in understanding where Consular Affairs at State Department is interested in understanding where schools are beginning to recruit and focus their efforts. So if you're really going outside of South Korea, China, India, et cetera, and say you were focusing more on Nigeria, they want to know that because they want to be sure that they can be staffed adequately to support that, those visa processes. But we believe that there also, and I think NAFSA staff believe this too, there needs to also be, some funding for the students themselves, because right now it's also very market driven in that those students who can afford a U.S. higher education on their own dime or their government's dime can afford to come here. But those USAID programs that used to exist to ensure that students from other parts of the world could study in the U.S. and then either go back and add to the development of those nations or, benefit in other ways, those programs really don't exist anymore. And I think there's an enormous opportunity to at least pilot them again, if not to fully invest in them. Another priority is to cement the consular changes that have been made. This administration has done a lot, as I mentioned, to try to improve things. One of the things I didn't mention that they have done, and I'd be interested whether your institutions are thinking this will help you or what would have to be done for it to help you, is they've changed the timeline for when people can apply for a visa. So now they can apply up to 360 days in advance of their program, though they couldn't enter 360 days in advance. The entry dates are, I think, the same as they've always been. But of course, our admission cycles are not 365 days in advance. So I don't know if campuses are thinking there's anything that can be done to make it more possible for students to take advantage of those advanced timelines, or if you see a way that just having even a few months or a couple of months or a couple of weeks would be helpful. So I think it can't hurt to have the 365 days, but I'd be curious whether your practices you think are changing at all to take advantage of that. So that's another improvement. But on the cementing of the changes, I think that the administration has to be very thoughtful about how they would go about this. If they use regulation, of course, there's public comments that could be good or bad, depending on who all weighs in. But some of these things that we really have benefited from, the very few silver linings in the COVID pandemic era, could go away, like waiving the personal in-person interview for those who've already received a visa in the past. And we'd like to see that not only continue, but also add more virtual interviews to the mix to help people with travel times. So we believe that Consular needs to continue to be partnered with and advocated with in order to do the right things to cement those changes. USCIS needs to do some processing improvements. I feel like I have just said the most obvious thing in the world when that sentence came out of my mouth. I will say that the leadership at USCIS is very focused on how they can actually make some processing changes so that things work better. A lot more focus on online, a lot of focus on figuring out where there's duplications in the process that could be eliminated. But it's no surprise to any of us that even just getting a simple EAD or once they're done with their education and want to move to other parts of USCIS processing, that those delays and backlogs are so long that it can make them pretty unusable. And then finally, another priority we see for the administration is curricular practical training, CPT guidance to increase use. A change was made a while back that tied it directly to the degree requirements for graduation. And we think that needs to be expanded. The guidance of how it can be used should be expanded so that students could use it for internships, for example, and not be using their OPT time before they graduate to do those things. For Congress, there are a lot of priorities of what we need to see, but I would say first and foremost, we do need to see legislation for Dreamers. There was that effort at the end of the last Congress. It didn't work. I don't know exactly when the moment will come where the stars will be aligned and the politics will line up for us to pass legislation for Dreamers. But as I said earlier about being at the table, we lose ground every day. We don't talk about the need for immigration reform and the need for immigration modernization and their need to make our system work for the people who are in our communities. So that legislation is a priority and will be something the President's Alliance and others will continue to push for. Another area that is needed is to modernize the immigration system for international students and scholars. And we have been working with NAFSA on some legislation, both in the House and the Senate. So a Republican in the House and a Democrat lead in the Senate, and the Democrat in the Senate is looking for a Republican co-sponsor. That immigration legislation would be very exciting for international educators because it would make a number of changes that would make it easier for students to be admitted into the United States, to pursue their education, and to stay in the United States and work if they wanted to, and contribute back that education to the United States after they graduate. So the key changes that will be in that legislation once introduced, and we will all want to rally behind it and ask for co-sponsors. And again, Erica Stewart and NAFSA will keep you informed when that happens. But we'll really want to lean in on getting excitement about this legislation when it happens. Because even if there isn't a vehicle for it to pass immediately, when legislation gets introduced, it usually becomes the template that people look to the next time they're trying to introduce something. So all that legislation that got introduced in the last Congress, every time someone starts to think again, like, oh, what should we do? They go, oh, what was in the CHIPS Act? Or, what was in the whatever act, any bill that was introduced in the last Congress, they look to those. But the two most exciting pieces of this legislation in my mind are that it will eliminate residence abroad and give dual intent to F students so that they could, in fact, have the intent to immigrate and not have to prove that they don't intend to. And then it will provide a path to green cards for students after graduating from U.S. institutions. And then the last thing that is an opportunity for influence in this Congress is the funding and oversight. And that means that for those appropriations bills that will be considered, there will be opportunities to try to shape where the funding goes or how it's done or which areas the world is focused on, as well as through NAFSA and the President's Alliance and other nonprofits in DC, trying to write report language that accompanies the funding bills that helps guide how it's implemented. And then I mentioned oversight earlier. Oversight is both good and bad. I think that the investigative side of the oversight may be conducted with kind of a gotcha lens and less of a let's make government work better lens. So that oversight may not be as helpful, but we have had really good luck and success with members of Congress who cannot necessarily pass legislation, but want to weigh in with the administration to get changes made there. And that's been a really helpful thing. So some of the consular changes that we've seen, we also worked with members of Congress to raise those issues with consular in order to get some of those changes made. So that is a tactic that tends to work well in a Congress like this. Sorry, I keep advancing too quickly. Let me see if I can go slower with my little fingers here. There we go. Okay, now what's next? I would say this is very obvious, but you want to stay informed, stay engaged, and advocate. And I want to point out a few key dates for you to do this. And then I'm going to share with you a couple of resources on the stay informed side. I'll say more about this Boston event on April 21st in just a moment. And I want to make sure that each of you receive an invitation to that event, especially those of you who are in Mass. But if you want to travel for it from wherever you are, that you'd be welcome to attend in person as well. And then, of course, the NAFSA conference is in May. And I know you'll all want to attend that with it being the 75th anniversary and so forth. But on staying informed, I want to make sure that everyone is aware of our higher education immigration portal website. And this is a website that is incredibly useful to you in your advocacy and even your campus work for all of the populations I mentioned, the international students, the refugee students, the undocumented students. And the portal is a joint project that's managed and spearheaded by the President's Alliance, where we collect data, narratives, and policy recommendations for the various populations. And then we also break it down by states. So if you were to look at, I just pulled this off the website today, but like if you were to look at the state page, you'd be able to see that 23 states and DC are providing in-state tuition to undocumented students, and that 17 of those and DC are providing what we call comprehensive access, which is, you know, the full package, so to speak. And you can look in the portal and you can see the tuition and financial aid equity issues, the professional and occupational licensure, driver's license, which I know is an issue for many students, admissions and funding opportunities, top states by international students, et cetera. And then just to give you a sample of one of the pages, I picked Mass, since I think they're kind of hosting this conference, but no shade to the other fabulous states in the region. And here you could see that you would be able to look at state data, state policy, narratives, effective practices, et cetera. And so I use this portal a lot when I'm trying to look and see how things are going and what's happening in any given state. In order to be able to make the case at the federal level in my case, but sometimes you want to make that at the state level. I also want to mention that this is not on the portal, but for Congress, when I mentioned that the key players have changed somewhat, the states that have really important members of Congress in key committee positions are in your region include Connecticut, Massachusetts, Delaware, New Hampshire, and Vermont. Rhode Island has maybe one member or so that it's a small state, but I guess many of them are small states, but there's kind of one person who's on a committee who could be interesting and important. And Maine, of course, has that sort of swing kind of vote power. But the other ones have members of Congress who are in key chairmanships and that sort of thing. So you're really in a key region, is my point, for having influence in Congress. And I think it's important to take advantage of that. Now, the event that I wanted to highlight before we open it up for questions and discussion and so forth is this event on April 24th. It's at the Edward M. Kennedy Institute for the U.S. Senate. That's where it's being hosted. And the event is done in collaboration with the President's Alliance, UMass Boston, and the Harvard Immigration Initiative. it's focusing on higher ed pathways to immigration and why it matters. So it will include university presidents and chancellors from your institutions who will be in attendance if they don't have other commitments. Some of them do have board of trustees meetings and other things that are going to prohibit them from attending in person. And in that case, they're sending someone else from the campus who could be you, or you may also attend in your own right if you'd like. And so I will make sure that you receive an invitation to this event. It was actually the brainchild, I would say, of the Office of Citizenship and Public Engagement, because there are millions of permanent residents in the United States who are eligible for citizenship who don't necessarily apply to move forward in that. And it's the Office of Citizen and Engagement's public engagement's job to make sure that everybody understands how they can go about achieving citizenship should they want it. So they wanted to do something in partnership with us. And then as we began talking with our higher ed partners in the state of Mass, and there are others involved as well who are speaking at the event. These are just the ones that are the sponsors of the event. We decided we really want to talk about not just how you would do it, but what are the barriers, what about dreamers and what can be done to make it smoother for international students, et cetera. So I think it's going to be a really great half-day event, and would love to see you there. So let me just open up the chat now and see what's been going on, and maybe Arthur and Susanna, if there are any questions, we can also bring those in.
So what I'm happy to do is if you want to, well, first, thank you very much. That was lovely. If you want to, at the bottom of your screen, using the reactions tool, if anyone wants to raise their hand, I can go through the participants and call on people who've raised their hands. If you want to ask a question and unmute yourself, I'm happy to do that. Or if you're a little shy like myself, you're welcome to throw your questions in the chat. I have to say, I really appreciated, I think when you've been in the field for a long time and, coming off of the past 3 years, it's very easy to get caught up in your own life and your own institution and your own office and your own students. And I have to say, I really appreciated the step back you presented on the initiatives that the Biden administration has been taking. It kind of reframes the work we do, and the updates to the FAM and the Security Advisory Opinion improvements. I was very excited to hear about the refugee student initiatives that may be coming in the future. And so I found that, inspiring and rejuvenating. And I was happy to hear that, and I really appreciate it. I also have to do a shameless plug for tomorrow.